Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Friday, the 1st of February, 2019. Who can believe that we're already so far into this new year? And as you can see, it's somewhat white background. And unfortunately, I decided that discretion being the better part of valor and pulled the plug on the episode of Humanity vs. Insanity last night. As we were sitting in the studio, and at about 6 o'clock, it absolutely started to drop the snow at a phenomenal rate. So driving back to my pad here on the edge of Dartmoor, I was driving through the proverbial blizzard. Thankfully, it was a lot easier driving south the previous evening. Well, so I'm going to cover some of the stuff this morning that I was going to cover last night on Humanity versus Insanity. And this relates really to Venezuela versus France, and this is a classic wag the dog scenario. Obviously, the Western globalists want to distract from what's occurring in France now, which is pretty much a full-blown uprising, certainly at the weekends, because people still have to live. And what's occurring is that the behavior of the CRS, the French riot police, and now it appears particularly in the border areas, riot police coming in from other countries. And of course this is a tactic that I was discussing with others over a decade ago, when it was very clear that the EU was starting to look at combining police and indeed military operations. And of course military unification is the massive elephant in the room, and very much thanks to Brian Gerrish and Mike Robinson at UK Column for being absolutely on point and relentlessly flagging up the EU military unification agenda, which British politicians just don't want to talk about. And you have to ask yourself the question, whose interests are they really acting upon? And the one thing I think it should be very clear to everybody right now is that it's not yours or my interests, it's their own selfish interests. And obviously that's why we have all this obfuscation and delay over Brexit, because they're desperate to try to protect their cozy lifestyle where they really have nothing to do except pretend to be parliamentarians, when in reality all they're really doing is creating theatre, whilst the civil servants rubber stamp EU-driven legislation onto the British statute books, exactly as required under the European Communities Act of 1972. So the British people have effectively lived under the mist of this lie for 47 years now. And fortunately, at this juncture, many people who thought it would be a good idea to remain in the EU are now seeing the multiple reasons why it's so crucial that we get out of this corporatist club, which you and I ain't in, as soon as possible. Now, obviously in France, the population of France have had enough. And the poison dwarf Macron, who came out of nowhere. Of course, he got into power because of all the fear porn being put about. Should Marine Le Pen actually get into office? Well, what could be worse than Macron's kowtowing to the corporatist agenda and unleashing the military force on the civilian population? The number of serious injuries now runs into the hundreds. The number of eyes that have been lost certainly is something in the region of 50 plus. And of course the latest there was Jerome Rodriguez, who was one of the, if you like, the more prominent of the Gilets Jaunes, the yellow vests. And it looks like he was deliberately targeted at the weekend, and unfortunately looks like he might have lost his sight. I believe that he's been put into an induced coma in an attempt to give the body time to recover. But this is now the norm. Each weekend we are seeing the riot police in France deliberately targeting prominent activists, and obviously this is an attempt to discourage others from participating. And Macron's philosophy is that this is a war of attrition. They're only going to be doing this at weekends, and you know what, we can just keep paying the riot police. We can bring in the riot police from France, from Spain, from Germany, from Italy and elsewhere, with no emotional or spiritual attachment to the population of France, and we can suppress this. Well, you're not going to see too much of this in the British media. An insider of the BBC has recently effectively admitted that the BBC is operating under a D notice, and has been effectively instructed by the British establishment not to put too much effort into reporting what's going on in France. So we need a distraction. So we have the classic wag the dog scenario, with all Western media attention on Venezuela. And the attitude is that very, very few people have any real knowledge about the South American economy or South American politics. So, the press can pretty much paint whatever picture it wants, and the gullible masses will simply believe it. So just as Chavez was demonized by the globalists for some 15 years or so because of his attempts to establish a socialist economy. Unfortunately, of course, when you have the full force of the globalists in opposition, then that's not too easy. But let's have a look at what's occurring here, because since Maduro was elected into office there, and by the way, he got I think it was some 60+% of the vote, and his nearest rival got 1/3 of the votes that he got, and all of the independent bodies observing the elections all declared that the elections were conducted in a free and fair manner. But of course, this doesn't suit the US agenda, particularly when Venezuela is sitting on close on 300 billion barrels of oil, and it's estimated that Venezuela actually has about 10% more reserves than Saudi Arabia. Now, those reserves have never been fully exploited, and in fact, Chavez's attitude was very much that Venezuela would only produce what it needed to provide for its own needs and generate sufficient foreign exchange for the needs of the country. So the production, was certainly somewhat limited, and the bottom line is that the US doesn't like the fact that Venezuela is sitting on such massive reserves and could potentially hold OPEC to ransom, although it doesn't appear to have had that on its agenda anytime recently. So let's have a look at what happened, because the inflation spiral really kicked off in a massive way very shortly after Maduro was sworn in as president. And of course, inflation is a way to not only destroy the economy, but also to destroy the value of any savings, particularly any savings held by the middle classes. So anyone who had savings in local currency, in the Venezuelan bolivar, those savings have effectively been eradicated. And of course, people have been realizing for some time that if you want to store wealth, the only ways in which you can store wealth effectively is in gold and silver. So obviously those in the upper echelons of Venezuelan society have made sure that they have a good stock of gold and silver. And of course, Maduro has recently tried to repatriate a significant amount of Venezuelan gold that was put on deposit at the Bank of England. And one of the reasons that the Bank of England has always held this reputation of being a trusted financial institution is that it was regarded as a safe haven, and that basically you could deposit your funds there, and then as and when there was the need to recall those funds, then obviously the bank would repatriate those funds. But Carney has broken with that tradition, and no doubt operating at the instruction of the globalists, and has refused to send Venezuela back the gold that is rightfully theirs. And indeed, Guaido, who is the puppet of the US administration and the puppet of the global corporatists, and has been acknowledged by some Western regimes, including the UK, as the interim president. This is a bit like the rest of the world recognising Jeremy Corbyn as the legitimate prime minister of the UK, because they don't like Theresa May. Now, there are many people in the UK who might like to see that happen, but in reality, that just wouldn't be legitimate in any way, shape or form. But that doesn't worry the globalists. So basically, they have instructed Carney to do the unthinkable and reject the application by Maduro to repatriate the gold. Now, consider the implications of this, because anyone anywhere else in the world watching what's going on, if they have deposits at the Bank of England, then the smart move is to get them out now, because basically the Bank of England cannot be trusted clearly to uphold the ideals of independent banking. Now, obviously everyone watching this has known for some time now that banking is not independent in any way, shape or form. Banking is simply the tool used by the global corporatists to establish their hegemony. So, one, we have the issue of the withholding of gold. The second, we have the issue of hyperinflation. Now, Venezuela's inflation is officially reported currently as 652.7% per annum. But Professor Steve Hank, an economist, says that actually the true inflation rate is 112,189%. Now, that's pretty specific. I'd love to see how he got to those numbers. But the bottom line is that when you have hyperinflation, then if you have local currency, which is the subject of the inflation, then you have to spend it immediately, because actually, even 10 minutes later, it's worth less, or will buy less in terms of purchasing power than when it first came into your hand. And of course, this is a deliberate strategy to destroy the economy, to destroy the store of wealth in local currency. And, unsurprisingly, once Maduro was sworn into office, it seems that the global banksters colluded to manipulate this massive inflation to destroy the economy and undermine the society in Venezuela. And, how this is going to pan out, it's not easy to see. But, of course, John Bolton, the US Secretary of State for Defense, and as I've said many, many times before, John Bolton believes that he was put on this mortal coil for one reason and one reason alone, and that was to initiate global conflict. And for the last 25 years, John Bolton has been doing his damnedest to initiate World War III. Fortunately, he's about as subtle as a kick in a rather delicate place. And, many, many people can see through him. And I actually think that Trump can see through him, which is one of the reasons that Trump put him into the role of Secretary of Defense, so that he can keep him very, very close. But Bolton has made it clear that the US very much wants US oil companies to have the opportunity to get into Venezuela, and, particularly around Lake Maracaibo, which is where the bulk of Venezuela's reserves lie, and effectively take control of those resources, and then obviously throw the crumbs to the people of Venezuela, whilst having the opportunity to absolutely dominate the global hydrocarbons markets. Now, we all know that, we are in the twilight years of a hydrocarbon-driven economy, but by that I mean probably, 50 or so years. And the globalists who have established this hydrocarbon-driven economy are not going to give it up without a massive fight. And if they can actually get their hands on the control of some 300 billion barrels of oil, then they know they can keep this hydrocarbon-driven economy going for quite some years yet. Now, why should we in the UK be interested in looking at what's occurring in both France and in Venezuela? Well, number one, what's occurring in France is a prima facie case of the way in which the EU totalitarian state has every intention of dealing with dissent. And of course, the EU military unification is an important tool so that they can literally bring foreign troops onto the soil of another nation state to quell any dissent. And so don't be at all surprised if we see what's occurring in France actually also spread to Germany, to the Netherlands. We've seen it on the streets in Catalonia and, Sweden. Yeah, the likelihood is that this dissent is going to spread because the bottom line is an increasing number of people are starting to realize that this fascist, communist state, that's fascist if you happen to be in the club, communist, socialist extreme if you don't. So in other words, those who are in the club, the Global Corporatist club, have a lifestyle which, basically means that they want for nothing, whereas everybody else is basically kept in abject poverty. Now, there is a fundamental flaw in this model because ultimately, global corporatists need people to buy their commodities, whatever those commodities might be. And as people literally run out of money and can literally just scratch enough to keep a roof over their head and food on the table, then obviously the ability to purchase those commodities produced by the globalists reduces dramatically. But they don't seem to have realized this yet. But it's coming. It's coming in spades. So this is the EU, but now the UK is on the cusp of Brexit. And Parliament, although obviously the bulk of the politicians live in their little bubble, but nonetheless it does seem to be filtering through that the will of the people, which was clearly stated in June of 2000, I've lost track of time, was it 16? In June 2016, 2.5 years ago, was very, very clear. 17.4 million people voted to get out of the EU, and thanks to what's occurring in France, thanks to how the EU negotiators have treated the UK in the course of the discussions, now the reality is, if there was, and there cannot be, but if there was a second referendum, the reality is that the vote to leave would be considerably greater than the first time round. But obviously the establishment would use that opportunity to manipulate a Remain vote. So the bottom line is the people of the UK have made their decision, and we want out, and we want out on March the 29th. Now, it's going to get a lot worse. Hopefully it won't get to the point of Venezuela, but it could, because there is no question that the globalists want to seriously hurt the UK economically and socially and politically. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if we see artificial inflation to erode the stored wealth by the middle classes. So, once again, gold and silver are the only surefire ways of protecting purchasing power of any stored wealth you may have. What we're going to see as well, obviously, is trade restrictions artificially applied. And, the good news is March the 29th is right at the very front end of the growing season. So all of this fear porn that's being put out in the media about the UK running out of food, running out of medicines, really? These corporations are not going to supply the UK when they have the opportunity to do so, and possibly get an even better deal for themselves than they're getting from the EU? I don't think so. But just in case, this is time for communities and particularly the thinking population within the communities, to start thinking about maybe using this opportunity to start preparing to grow your own food. And of course, this flags up the Codex Alimentarius agenda, which I was speaking about 10 years ago, which is the agenda to outlaw the use of natural healthcare products and also to prevent people from growing their own foods. But, that isn't actually in place right now. And, I hope that the British people would suddenly realise that any attempt to prevent them growing their own produce, of course, is a massive part of the corporatist agenda to ensure that the only providers of essential commodities are the global corporatists. So this is really a time to start thinking. We have politicians that have had 2.5 years to prepare for Brexit, but of course Theresa May was put into the role to screw it up because they knew she did not have the intellectual capacity to be able to negotiate an appropriate exit strategy. And unfortunately, here we are with 2.5 months. But you know what? Everything is probably going to work out, provided we, the collective we, get involved. Because what the establishment wants is people to literally dig a hole, stick their head in it and go, let me know when it's all over. Well, it's not going to be all over unless we actually participate in the process. So in many, many respects, unfortunately, it is going to get worse before it gets better. But the reason it's going to get worse is because basically people aren't taking enough interest yet. It's unfortunately only when it gets up real close and personal that people decide that they actually maybe have to invest a little bit of time in supporting their community because it's beneficial to their family. So, we have a little under 2 months to prepare for March 29th. On March the 29th, I think I'm actually giving a presentation in West Wales on that date, but there needs to be a massive response to Parliament. That needs to be the day that we come out of the EU, and that needs to be the day that the people of the UK start to participate in the future of this country from an economic, a political and a cultural point of view. So ultimately, it is down to each and every one of us. So thanks for sharing with me this morning, and please share this around because obviously social media would appear to be, for some reason, finding ways to restrict the distribution from the likes of myself and UK Column and 21st Century Wire. So, it means that each one of us needs to throw another pebble into the pond. So have a great weekend, and I will be back with you on Monday morning. Now, next week I'm going to be visiting with David Noakes, who of course was jailed in November for having the audacity to develop and produce an extremely effective cancer treatment known as GC-MAF. And on Friday, I shall be back in the northeast supporting Mark Steele, and hopefully the public gallery of the court, which is yet to be finally determined, but whichever court it is that the case is heard in Newcastle, and we'll keep you posted, then hopefully the public gallery will be absolutely rammed as Mark challenges his conviction for a threatening behaviour against 2 Gateshead councillors. And of course, Gateshead Council is still refusing to address his concerns and the concerns of his community over the 5G and LED street lighting. So, very exciting times. Get involved. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.